Hello, fellow foodies. This is Cassandra Quave, the host of Foodie Pharmacology, the science podcast for the food curious. This week, we have a very special guest, John Drori. You may know John from one of his 4 amazing TED Talks on botany, which have had millions of views. He's also the author of the international bestseller, Around the World in 80 Trees, that's now in 18 languages, and its latest sequel, Around the World in 80 Plants, which has just been published. John has been on the board of the Royal Botanic Gardens Kew and the Eden Project, and he's also an ambassador for the World Wildlife Fund. Thanks so much for coming on the show, John.
Thanks for having me. Hello, how are you?
I'm good. Well, I'm really excited to speak with you. You're such an amazing science communicator. I mean, your TED Talks, there's a reason they've been viewed millions of times. Really insightful looks at the plant world.
I have a feeling it's just because I'm English and people like the accent.
Well, you have to use every advantage you've got, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Well, why don't we start with just a basic question of, can you tell us a little bit about how you became interested in plants, science, and food, and how all those things intersect?
Yeah, I grew up in southwest London in England, near a place called the Royal Botanic Gardens Kew, which is the sort of great grandmother and grandfather of all the botanic gardens in the world. And my father had come to Britain as a new immigrant from Eastern Europe and had had to retrain from botany, which was his first love, into engineering. And the way that he satisfied his interest in botany, and actually my mother's interest in botany as well, the way they satisfied that was to take my brother and me, or actually drag us around the Kew Gardens every week between the age, I was every week between the age of about 3 and probably 14, where I probably rebelled. And they jollied us along with the usual kind of sweets and ice cream, but also stories about the plants. And my mother was particularly interested in the beauty, my father particularly interested in the science. And between them, my brother and I got this fantastic grounding, if you like, in botany and in stories about plants. And when things got really difficult, if it was pouring rain or what have you, then they would jolly us along by sort of feeding us bits of the plants. And that was fantastic when, they were herbs and spices and so on. And we used to go into the hot houses and have really exotic tastes. And it was wonderful, sort of surreptitiously taking a little leaf here and there or a little flower here and there. And then I remember the time very vividly when my dad sort of found the seed pod of an opium poppy and cut it. And it was exuding the little opium latex. And he said, have a little lick of that. I was about 9 at the time. And I remember the sensation on my tongue wasn't really anything terribly special. It was a sort of, in my memory, it made a little bit of my tongue go ever so slightly numb. But, the way you'd have it if you had a little lick of ice cream, really. But the really big effect was when I told my teacher at school and was bragging about it, and they sent round a social worker.
Oh no!
to talk to my mum, and I remember my mum was all sort of up to her arms and cooking at the time at the door, and she said it's only opium. But that was how I sort of started getting my interest, really, and then some of the stories that I remember my dad told me, I think I was about 11 or so, when he said, look, I'm going to tell you a really serious story now. And he took a little piece of a plant that we call Diffenbachia, which I think in the United States you call dumb canes.
Yes, I was about to say dumb canes.
The reason that it's called dumb canes has a very sort of unpleasant history, because it was a plant that was given to enslaved people to basically keep them quiet or as a punishment. And my father had a sort of difficult time. He'd lost his family during the war, and slavery and man's inhumanity to man were subjects that he found difficult to broach. And he talked to me about slavery through this plant, and telling me the story of how the plant had been used as a sort of punishment in the southern United States, and and of course the plant is covered in warnings saying do not feed this to your dog or your child.
Yeah, or anything. It's full of those calcium oxalate crystals. It was a really big, horrific way it was used also in the Caribbean with the African slaves in the Caribbean to, punish people and causes your tongue to swell pretty seriously, and can kill you from just blocking the air passageway if
well,
it's too
just
swollen.
as an experiment, I tried a little bit. I mean, he gave me a tiny piece, you know, I mean, that was a minuscule piece, but I tried a little bit more recently, just when I was writing the book, just to see, and it is, as you describe, a really sort of unpleasant thing. And I sort of, you know, as I was researching the book, I discovered more and more of the history that either I was never taught, which I think is actually probably the right way to look at it, or that at least it went in one ear and out the other as a schoolboy. And there were quite a lot of plants that really have a strong association with either slavery or empire or colonialism, which you know, one has to have pretty mixed feelings about. Actually, there's a flower in the Bahamas. It's a sort of very well known in the Bahamas, called the peacock flower, and or at least that's its common name. It's Quesalpinia pulcherrima, and this plant, I don't know why it's called the peacock flower, because where anytime I've ever seen peacocks, they've always been blue, but this is a sort of bright yellow and orange flower. It's sort of pollinated by butterflies, and you know, it's done some quite interesting things to keep the hummingbirds away. But the seeds have been used as an abortive drug. And tribal people in the Caribbean have used it for generations and generations, you know, hundreds and hundreds of years, as a sort of form of birth control. But of course, enslaved people did the same thing, so that women avoided having children who would be brought into a sort of backbreaking life of slavery. So it's got a very sort of, you know, a lot of these stories have a kind of poignant, difficult side to them.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think it is interesting as you learn more of these plant stories, you begin to see the world in a whole different way, because, you know, what might to one person just be a beautiful flower actually has a tremendous history behind it. One of my favorite stories is that of the story of Jeanne Barré. Are you familiar with her?
No, I don't think I know this one.
So Jeanne Barré was this, you know, 17th century herb woman who was the first to circumnavigate the globe. And whenever I see this gorgeous, showy Bougainvillea, I always think of her and her bravery in going on this journey, disguised as a man, by the way, on this journey during this period. I mean, every plant has some interesting history behind it. And yeah.
I love the fact that Bougainvillea, if I've got this right, the beautiful colouring is not in what we think of as flowers, but they're actually just sort of the leaves that you know, and some of the bracts that look have this sort of fantastic vivid purple colour. Yeah,
exactly. And now it's, you know, you can find it in so many places as a decorative plant. You mentioned something earlier too about, you know, the role of plants in kind of colonial expansion, and many of the plants that all of our listeners enjoy today have played a role in this. If you think about cotton, coffee, chocolate, all of these things that we kind of take for granted as things that are easily available, weren't always so, and came at great cost to people historically.
Yes, I mean you know, the Spanish conquest of Central America and the north coast of South America was sort of pretty unpleasant, actually. I mean, the Aztecs were, you know, had some pretty unusual practices themselves, but you know, the Spanish conquest was a cruel time. But of course, they brought back lots and lots of plants to Europe that you know, have become hugely important. So, you know, you know, many of the things that you mentioned, but, you know, sugar from the Caribbean, tobacco, tomatoes, potatoes from Peru. In fact, tomatoes, when they were introduced into Britain, Gerard, in his Herbal in 1597, he wrote that tomatoes were of rank and stinking savour, and you know, you can understand on the one hand why he felt this because they're a member of the Solanum family, and the Solanum family, along with potatoes, and there are some pretty unpleasant things in the Solanum family. So there's mandrake, which has a whole fantastic kind of occult history, but also things like that we call deadly nightshade. I don't know if that's a plant that you have in the United States, but it's pretty unpleasant stuff. So lots of cyanides, lots of really unpleasant things in them. And so he was probably swayed in his view about tomato because of that, knowing it was part of that family. But on the other hand, he also at the same time knew that the Italians and the Spanish were tucking into tomatoes and enjoying them like anything. And his words set back the tomato marketing in Britain by about 200 years.
Wow. Yeah.
and in the United States, tomatoes became popular because they were seen as a sort of health thing. First of all, that's and then you had this great debate about whether they were vegetables or fruit, and they got defined as vegetables only because of tax reasons.
Yeah.
So they would be taxed differently.
It's amazing, yeah, how we view different foods and also how they're regulated. I'm thinking, the extension of that in our U.S. kind of food system is for the purposes of school children. The tomato sauce is considered a vegetable, which is actually, the commercial tomato sauce is full of it's actually got probably more corn than tomato because of the corn syrup that's added to sweeten these sauces. But it's fascinating how these transform it and are such an integral part of our history. Well,
sorry, I was just going to say that it's interesting that you should bring up corn, or as we call it in this country, in England, we call it maize. But corn has a kind of mixed history, really, because it's one of those plants that if you eat too much corn, you can get sort of deficiency diseases that are linked with a sort of lack of a chemical called niacin. And if you eat the sort of indigenous people of the United States used to eat corn alongside squash and legumes and so on, and which was a sort of good balanced diet, but also used to cook the corn in an alkali mixture, which meant that this sort of chemical thing didn't happen, and that you didn't get these deficiency diseases. But in the early 19th century, there were 100,000 people who were mentally deficient in the southern United States because of essentially kind of eating too much corn. And the advertising was all eat corn somewhere or another every meal. It's and if you look on your cereal packet now, you'll see that niacin is added back in, so we don't get these deficiency diseases. But it's sort of quite a interesting history, really, that corn has.
Absolutely, and it's interesting as well how in the indigenous cuisine they sorted out ways to get around that problem through changing the pH of the food.
That's right, by adding a little bit of wood ash or eggshell into the water. Yeah.
So simple and effective. Well, I want to talk a bit about your latest book on Around the World with 80 Plants. So beautiful. I love the cover, by the way. It's so
got
colorful.
These fantastic illustrations in it as well by Lucille Clerc. She's a French artist, very sort of whimsical and wonderful, living in London.
Oh my goodness.
And they are, so it's not really a coffee table book. It's it's got plenty of text and everything, but they're just such beautiful pictures. And if you look really closely, she's put all sorts of funny little detail in there that you can kind of. It's like a kid's book for adults.
That's great. That's great.
I love that one of the tomato. Of the pineapple.
Oh, that's beautiful. Wow. And so on Earth, we have around close to 400,000 species of plants. How did you narrow down the field to 80?
Well, it's a great question. I mean, when I did Around the World in 80 Trees, which was the sort of previous one, I had 60,000 trees to choose from, and I had to choose 80. And as you say, about 400,000 plants. I've counted seaweeds and so on as plants as well, and mosses, and so there are maybe even more than 400,000. My first criterion was there had to be a geographical spread around the world. Second was that I wanted different plant families and different kinds of plants represented. So there's everything from carnivorous plants to agricultural crops to really obscure things to more familiar things and so on. And then the most important thing for me was that in each story that I told, because it's essentially 80 biographies, 80 stories about different species, in each one, I wanted to make sure that whatever the expertise that someone was bringing to it, there would be something new. So there would be something in each story that would be new, whether you were a gardener or a historian or just a sort of quite interested in cookery or whatever. And that whittled away a lot, actually. And there's a combination in there of research on the latest sort of scientific papers, where I turned up the most, kind of amazing things that people are discovering now, and also very old documents. One of the things that I just turned up, which is researched just in the last year and a half or so, was actually about tomatoes. Or I keep saying tomatoes, but you say tomatoes.
Yeah, it's like
you know what I mean.
Tomato, potato, potato. That's right.
Solanum lycopersicum.
There we go.
But the one of the things I discovered about tomatoes is that, of course, they're buzz pollinated, so they need bumblebees to come along and clamp themselves onto the flowers and buzz like frenzy. And in fact, they raise the wing beat just to sort of vibrate the pollen out, that's all well known. But get this, in South Korea, scientists have discovered that if you play loud sound, a high C, that is, not a mid C, a high C, loud to green tomatoes, you can delay their ripening by about 6 or 7 days. And it's to do with the way that the sort of RNA is expressed in these plants, and which affects then the ripening hormone that plants make. And it just kind of extraordinary, not only that that works, but also that somebody discovered it. Hey, let's play some loud sound to these tomatoes.
That's amazing. Well, I've always heard about, people saying that playing music to plants, that plants like to hear music. And I'm like, really? But what does that actually mean? Like, is this real science? That's amazing.
Well, and it's funny because our next in line to the throne, Prince Charles, everyone made huge fun of him in the 1980s when he said that he talked to plants and things. And some of us affectionately still do a bit. But there was another piece of research from the Volcani Institute in Israel where they took plants of the Impatiens family, which is kind of busy lizzie and Himalayan balsam and those sort of things. And they monitored the constituents of the nectar that the plant is obviously producing in order to, sort of repay insects that are going to carry the pollen somewhere else. And they discovered that the plant was modulating the content of the nectar according to what insect was coming along. And they did that before the insect had arrived, and they worked out that it was the sound. So the sound of a butterfly and the sound of a bee are very different, and they each need a different kind of mix of amino acids and sugars and so on. And the plant was able to respond in about 15 seconds to give a different range of chemicals to the pollinator.
That is amazing. It's amazing. Well, I mean, I think so many of us, when we see plants, we think of them as kind of static creatures because they don't move around like animals, and but in reality, they're communicating with each other. They're changing their expression of different genes and chemicals, and and don't get me started on the whole, everything happening beneath the soil with all of the fungi and communication systems across these, mycorrhizae. It's amazing.
Yeah, it is absolutely incredible what's going on. And I love the idea, I mean, you've sort of hinted at it there, of things that are hidden in plain sight. That there's this whole world that we could see if only we knew where to look. So there's the ultraviolet patterning on flowers that's kind of it's like landing strips for landing lights for bees, who they see in green, blue and ultraviolet, we see in red, green and blue. And so, they're seeing patterns that we can't perceive. But if you have the right camera and lenses, you can see those things. That you've got the the sort of trees that are responding to being attacked by sending kind of chemicals wafting through the air or through the underground mycorrhizal networks that say, hey, you might want to manufacture some defense chemicals as well. I mean, that's just extraordinary, isn't it?
It is. It's so interesting because I can tell you that when I was taking my introductory biology courses as a student, I never recall learning any of these things. Maybe they weren't quite known then. It's just a whole new way of looking at nature.
But I think that it's just bad teaching, which I had as well, right? So other than my parents who gave me sort of a real interest in it, I think it's really just sort of poor teaching, because if you go back as far as Darwin and look at what he wrote, just observing plants. Okay, so the language is a little bit kind of archaic to us, and it's not so easy to read sometimes, but it's really exciting, and he all that work on orchids and their crazy relationship with pollinators is fantastic. Yeah. And it's so bizarre and so amazing. And this was in this, mid 19th century, so I think it was just that you were taught badly and I was taught badly. So how is it that you ended up in where you have, if you didn't get this very good grounding in biology at school?
Well, I mean, I guess I had a solid basic grounding. It really came from, honestly, my training with indigenous healers, that I began to have a better appreciation for the many complex interactions, not only between people and plants, but also plants and other organisms and their environment. I mean, you think about, within the Peruvian Amazon, there are all kinds of myths and lore about relationships between animals and plants, and there are beliefs around the ways, or that the ways that plants present themselves in the harvest. And you see this not just in the Amazon, but all across the world, that you should harvest the leaves of this plant in the morning, or only collect this liana when it's a certain girth to make your medicine. So I think that going even well beyond, before Darwin, looking to many of these indigenous healers across the globe, they've had insights into these interactions. It just hasn't quite translated itself so well over to Western kind of dogmatic principles of teaching yet.
I think a lot of the things which we sometimes disregard as superstition actually have a really important kind of role. And for example, in Madagascar, a lot of the baobab trees there, the Adansonia, they're protected because people, sort of the folk belief, nobody really believes it actually, but it's the sort of folk belief that your ancestors, the spirit of your ancestors, live in the baobab, and so people sort of protect them. And it's not so much that they literally believe that the ancestors live there, but more like kind of they represent your ancestors, and therefore you should sort of, in the way that we wouldn't desecrate a graveyard. And that has actually a very kind of useful function, because people protect the trees. And similarly, in West Africa, there are many stories about the yams, and there are yam festivals. But of course, a lot of yams are actually quite dangerous to eat. And so a lot of these folk stories and fairy stories and things that they have are about, someone eating the wrong variety and so on. And this is a way that you educate people. And, it's not like people actually believe it literally, but it's just a sort of lovely thing that's kind of built into the culture. And I think that those stories are often really useful pointers for us coming to it, that you kind of you can sort of think, well, I wonder what lies behind this. And I'm just thinking about this in our village at the moment. I'm sitting here talking to you about 130 miles southwest of London, in a village where we're wondering what to do with a kind of communal space in the middle, which is this sort of, we call it the paddock, and it's just a sort of, I don't know, it's about 200 yards by 200 yards in the middle of this little village, which has about 18 or 19 houses in it. And for the older people in the village, they want to mow it, and they want to keep it completely flat like a cricket ground. And of course, those of us who are either younger or sort of young at heart and understand biodiversity and the need for biodiversity and so on, want to have sections of it with flowers or left completely wild. plant some trees and so on, in order to encourage the insects and nature to come back. And, you know, I was trying to sort of see the world through their eyes. And for them, they come from a generation where keeping nature at bay was really important. And I think that a lot of that is in the United States when I look at it, you know, that the sort of, you know, it's not that many generations since actually people were at war with nature, really.
Yes.
And that kind of explains a lot of how people feel. You know, and the way they express it, they might not sort of realize what's going on in their subconscious about, you know, and they talk about the lack of tidiness, and they hate the fact that, you know, someone has a front yard that's kind of not been mown and got beautiful kind of golf course kind of grass on it. Whereas I look at it and I think, you know, that looks like a green desert, but they're probably thinking, you know, that's sort of wrong. And you know, so I think understanding that is an important, you know, sort of, I don't know, it's something on the way to helping them to change their minds, I hope.
Yeah, no, I am of the exact same mindset. I mean, when you look through, you know, a typical American suburb, we, you know, I would guess that one of our largest kind of forms of monoculture here is of grass, you know, of getting these uniform grasses that we put a tremendous amount of herbicides into the environment, pesticides, you know, water usage that's often improper in these settings. And it's to create kind of, like you said, a biodiverse, you know, absent kind of environment, in this quest to kind of have this cookie cutter tamed look. I'm a big fan of going wild. I really want to transform my backyard into just it's a small yard, but there's some sort of like wildflowers, and let it go.
Yeah. I mean, if you look at it from grass's point of view rather than our point of view, then you know, the grass has been like extraordinarily effective because, you know, not only have we sort of uprooted forests all over the world to grow, you know, the key grasses, which are our crops, you know, the sort of rice and wheat and so on. These are grasses, you know, but we also fight over golf courses and, you know, all this kind of thing. It's like the grass is probably just thinking, wow, have we ever managed to manipulate human beings? This is fantastic.
It's true. This will be the era of like the rule of the poaceae of the grass family. That's great. Well, I want to dive into some other stories in your book. I'm really interested in the history of nutmeg because I think, you know, it has a very interesting history that, you know, involves even characters such as Marco Polo and the Dutch, and now even, you know, the improper use of it as a hallucinogen in American prisons, which, by the way, you're hallucinating because you're getting close to very toxic doses of certain compounds in nutmeg. What can you tell us about nutmeg?
Well, nutmeg is a kind of amazing thing, and you know, the worst thing that we get up to with it nowadays is mainly powdering it in advance of use rather than grating it at the end of cooking, and you know, a lot of the flavor is destroyed by cooking, so you should really put it in at the end. And if you do that right, then even something as banal as boiled rice pudding can be quite nice. But back in the sort of you know, 17th century or so, nutmeg was a hugely big deal because there was only one source of it in the world, and that was in the island of Run, which is now in Indonesia. And the French and the British and the Spanish all fought each other for decades and decades and decades about, you know, basically getting rights to you know, monopoly rights for nutmeg. And eventually, after, you know, there's quite a sizable loss of life going on, and of course, you know, these are colonial powers. Forget the people who are living there.
Yeah.
You know, eventually in 1667, the British said to the Dutch, who had the island at the time, have the nutmeg, just take it. We'll just have some little thing in return, you know, one of your little colonial outposts, see how business is done. We'll just have somewhere else. we'll take that little place in North America, Manhattan. So Manhattan was traded for, originally traded supposedly with the indigenous tribes, but afterwards was traded between the Dutch and the British in return for rights to nutmeg. And nutmeg is an amazing plant. All plants need to find a way of dispersing their seeds, right? So the seed doesn't compete with the mother tree. And in nutmeg, you have this lovely fleshy fruit, which is very attractive to certain animals, who then come along and swallow the seed inside, which has an aril, a sort of seed coating, which is this lovely, beautiful, bright red web kind of thing, which is the spice we call mace. And not the stuff you spray in people's faces in the United States. This is a different thing. And the thing that comes along and eats this thing is a nutmeg pigeon. It's a big sort of bird, and they poop out the seed somewhere else, and it gets dispersed. And in the 18th century, not only was nutmeg terribly expensive, as a sort of flavoring and an ingredient, and Leonardo da Vinci back in 1510, had said, oh, he needed one as an amulet. It was a sort of something that you'd carry with you. He said he had his sort of shopping list of acquire a skull, spectacles, nutmeg. This is what he needed to take on his trip to Padua.
That's great.
But in the 18th century, it was the Viagra of the day. It was absolutely an aphrodisiac and performance enhancer, and or seen as that. And young men used to sort of carry around a silver nutmeg grater around the streets of London. They sort of have it in their waistcoat pocket, whip out the nutmeg grater and just give themselves a little dose of it if they think they needed it. And you can imagine the combination of scarcity and the fact that it was this aphrodisiac and performance enhancer. The price was absolutely, sky high. And much later, in the 1940s, Malcolm X, the sort of Black American activist, he and his mates took nutmeg in prison as a sort of way of getting high, really, a sort of what else was there to do in prison? And as a result, when he wrote his autobiography, nutmeg got banned from American prison kitchens, so people couldn't sort of get high on it. And I remember as a student trying to get high on nutmeg, and I don't know whether you've done this or not, but I mean, it's not a very attractive thing, because it makes you kind of horribly throw up, and it's just sort of awful, and the hallucinations are paled into insignificance beside the sort of throwing up.
Yeah.
Don't try that one at home.
Well, it's fascinating how you mentioned earlier too the flavoring, and also just for the audience to know, the amount of nutmeg that you're using in a typical recipe in the kitchen is not going to yield these types of effects. So no worries, you're not going to throw up.
Yeah, I mean, this is true. A lot of spices, are quite sort of chemically, biologically active, and they've evolved that way because they want to deter herbivores from eating them, they want to sort of stop insects attacking them and all of that. So they have these chemicals, but something, if you think about salt, I mean, if you take masses and masses of salt, that would be bad, but exactly. What we use in cooking is fine. So nutmeg, you're safe with nutmeg.
That's great. And I think, one thing you touched on just a moment ago too is about the time of maximal flavor, because we also see this with black pepper, right? Is when you have nutmeg as being pre-ground, you lose a lot of those volatile compounds that really impart the flavor and the full spectrum of aromas that you get from the spice. And the same can be said for black pepper. You're going to get much more out of it if it's freshly ground.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and I'm not sure what the effect is of cooking on the sort of bactericidal and sort of effects of these spices, but yeah, I mean, and not only even if you're cooking with them, so things like turmeric and chili pepper and coriander seed and so on, if you go to South and Southeast Asia, where people are really using a lot of these spices and frequently, they'll pretty much always grind them just before cooking rather than have them already powdered.
Yeah.
And what I like about that is actually that it slows you down. That's to me part of the whole eating process, and is that you just slow down a little bit.
Yeah, I like that. Yeah, this it kind of falls into the whole slow food perspective of using those whole ingredients too. Well, on the topic of plant aphrodisiacs, because I think this is something that's really interesting, what else can you tell us about plant aphrodisiacs? I mean, are there a lot of these types of plants out there? What do we know about them scientifically? I mean, have these been scientifically validated, or is it more around lore of their uses?
Well, the thing about aphrodisiacs is if you believe in them strongly enough, they work, right? And in a lot of cultures, you find that plants that have a very high protein and calorific content are regarded as aphrodisiacs. And you can imagine that if people are being a bit underfed and have malnutrition, then that's not great for your libido. And so, having something like avocados, which were seen as aphrodisiacs in sort of indigenous culture, is understandable. The way the avocado was marketed in the United States is quite interesting, though, because they were originally called alligator pears back in the sort of 20s and 30s, and they weren't terribly popular. And the reason was probably to do with the fact that alligators are not really that kind of cuddly, and people didn't feel too good about it. So they took the Native American word and used the word avocado, which is similar to that. And as part of the kind of rebranding, the marketing people loudly and frequently said, "This is not an aphrodisiac. That's ridiculous to suggest it's an aphrodisiac." The reports, the rumors of this being an aphrodisiac are totally not true. And of course, everyone goes, "Oh, it must be true." and the use kind of skyrocketed. Then there are plants that definitely sort of decrease people's inhibitions. So we know that alcohol kind of does that. Whether it's an aphrodisiac in all cultures, there's a big difference between the way football hooligans in Europe drink alcohol and the way a French family would drink alcohol, or the way a pair of lovers would drink alcohol at a dinner. These are different ways of using the drug. But there's a plant from West Africa called iboga, Tabananthe iboga, which is something that is kind of associated with various initiation rites. It's being explored in the West actually to wean people off heroin addiction, so it's quite an interesting, potentially quite an interesting treatment for that. But that's seems to have kind of a lowering sexual inhibitions kind of thing. It's not necessarily to do with performance enhancing, but it's a kind of takes away inhibitions. And then in Britain, we have stinging nettles, which people have used to, for all sorts of sort of sexual purposes.
Oh, really?
which doesn't sound terribly appealing to me, I have to say. But I chose nettles in the plants book. I chose nettles to represent England, not because of the kind of weird sexually repressed thing, though I could have done that, but more because there's something about nettles that represents England in terms of sort of mild peril. There's nothing really out to get you here, unlike the States where you have sort of rattlesnakes and bears and things. And so about the worst you can get is a nettle sting, which is pretty mild. And the Romans, when they were here, the worst possible posting in the Roman Empire was the border between England and Scotland, which was the Hadrian's Wall at the time. And so these poor Roman soldiers, they were, blue with cold. used to try and warm themselves up by whacking themselves over the shoulder with a bunch of nettles that would just sort of make you feel a bit warm for a bit. But here's the thing. People seem to be discovering now that for people who have rheumatism and arthritis, which are kind of autoimmune diseases, that there seems to be some evidence. In other words, it's not particularly high quality evidence yet, but there's some evidence that these sort of nettle stings can prompt the immune system to act in a slightly different way, and seems to relieve some of the symptoms of rheumatism and arthritis. So, the jury's out, but it's an interesting one.
That's fabulous. I mean, also because nettles are such a great nutritious food ingredient as well for, as a green vegetable, and also in tea. I mean, there's so many uses of that plant.
I mean, I think personally, I think the tea is a bit overrated, and I find it a bit dull. But there are other plants I prefer, like lemon balm is fantastic. Melissa, if you can grow that, that's beautiful in tea. That's really good. And for some reason, you don't see dried packs of it. You sort of need, or you don't in Europe anyway. Or linden, lime flower, tilia for the big trees.
Yes.
That's fantastic in tea. But I think that the nettles in soup are, if you get them when they're young, obviously rubber gloves. As soon as you start cooking them, then the sting goes away, right? So you're not going to get sore throat or sore mouth or anything, and they're pretty good. Yeah, you have to sort of add a bit of fried onion, a bit of garlic, a bit of lemon juice.
Yeah.
They're
up a bit.
They're a vehicle.
Yeah, I have a funny story with nettles. When I was a graduate student out doing my field work on my own for the first time, I just hated wearing gloves because I get so hot when I'm out, and this is in southern Italy. And I distinctly remember the day I grabbed a handful of stinging, not realizing that they were nettles, because I was still learning taxonomy at that point. And growing up in Florida, we don't have a lot of nettles there. So I grabbed them with my hand, and it was on fire. Like, oh, this is, I need to wear gloves in the future.
Well, because we have a system of public rights of way here, footpaths all over the country. So, which often go across kind of fields and, through hedges and all of that kind of thing. So just yesterday I got, pretty much stung with nettles.
That's great. Well, John, as we wrap up, I think, why don't we go to, what was your favorite plant to research and write about for this book?
So one of my favorite plants is there's this beautiful drawing. I don't know if you can see that by Claire, and it's this tree here, and this is that was in Namibia in Southwest Africa, and that tree is called the quiver tree. It's Aloedendron, and it's quite a close relative of aloe vera, which people are familiar with from cosmetics and so on. But this thing is kind of 60 feet high, and when people say to me, why is it such a favorite? And they think I'm going to say because it thrives in this incredible desert environment where nothing else is growing. And of course, that is amazing. But the reason I love it, there's two other reasons. The first is that it's the national plant of Namibia. So whenever anyone sees it, they smile. Right, so that's one reason. And it's a bit like driving a Morris Minor car, everyone kind of grins at you. And then the second reason is that it's got this kind of waxy coating, powdery coating, that when you touch it, it's very sort of lovely, sort of smooth coating, which actually helps protect the plant from ultraviolet rays. But the idea of being a plant that everyone smiles at and that everyone wants to touch and stroke, I think that's the tree I would be. The quiver tree
of Namibia, which is an aloe. I didn't even realize that aloes could get that large. That's amazing.
Yeah, it's fantastic, and the flowers and you get all this life around it, of insects and birds and everything. That's just extraordinary. Yeah.
That's great. I'll have to add that one to my bucket list of plants to visit. And we talked about speaking with plants earlier, and I'm definitely one of those people that talks to plants that I meet in nature. So on my hikes, I'll stop and greet the ones that I recognize. So I'll be sure to greet that one next time I see it.
Yeah. Well, you'd be a great person to go for a hike with.
Yeah. Great. Well, thank you so much, John, for coming on the show. And tell us again, where can our listeners find out more about your book? Where do you have a website that we can direct them to?
So here are the two books: Around the World in 80 Trees, Around the World in 80 Plants. Around the World in 80 Trees is in about 18 languages now, and Around the World in 80 Plants is just come out, so it's just in 3 or 4 languages, but English is there. And they can be found in, any good bookshop, Amazon, all the usual places. And if you want to find out more about me and my work, then I'm at johndrori.co.uk. So that's JONDRORI, johndrori.co.uk.
That's great. And I know you have links there also to your TED Talks, which I think are fabulous to watch for any of you that haven't seen it yet in the audience. To learn about, even more cool things about plants.
Thank you.
That's great. Thank you. You've been listening to Foodie Pharmacology, the science podcast for the food curious, recorded on Skype. You can find this and all of our other episodes at foodiepharmacology.com. You can also view video of this episode and others at the Teach Ethnobotany YouTube channel. Thanks so much to our producers, to Rob Cohen and Christine Roth, for pulling this show together. And thank you to you, our listeners, for sticking with us. We're having a great time exploring all of the cool ways that people interact with plants across medicine, food, and the diet. Thanks so much for listening. Stay healthy out there, and I'll see you next time.